The blood-curdling scream of a woman's voice echoed through the dusty streets of Silverstone, Montana, as Dillon Nash drew his revolver with lightning speed, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his well-worn Stetson. It was 1876, and trouble found him as naturally as rain found the earth. "Please," the woman sobbed, clutching her reticule to her chest as two men cornered her in the alley behind the general store. "Take my money, but leave me be." Dillon's spurs clinked against the hardened dirt as he approached, his shadow stretching long in the late afternoon sun. "I believe the lady's made herself clear," he said, his voice as rough as sandpaper from years of trailed dust and whiskey. The would-be thieves turned, recognition flickering in their eyes. One of them, the taller one with a scraggly beard, backed away slowly. "Nash," he muttered. "We were just having a conversation." "Seems rather one-sided," Dillon replied, his gun steady despite the whiskey still coursing through his veins from hours at the saloon. "Best you boys find somewhere else to be." They scattered like cockroaches in lamplight, and Dillon holstered his weapon with practiced ease. The woman stood trembling, her blue eyes wide with fright and gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she said, smoothing down her simple but well-made dress. "I'm Winifred Palmer. I arrived on today's stagecoach." Dillon tipped his hat slightly, but kept his distance. "Madam," he acknowledged, already turning to leave. He had no interest in conversation, especially with a lady who looked like she belonged in one of those fancy Eastern parlors, not in the dust and danger of Silverstone. "May I know the name of my rescuer?" she called after him. He paused, not looking back. "Nash. Dillon Nash." Then he continued on his way, back toward the saloon that had been his second home since returning from the war. Behind him, Winifred watched with curious eyes, unaware that fate had just entangled their lives in ways neither could imagine. Sheriff Thomas Rollins looked up from his desk as Dillon pushed through the jailhouse door the following morning. The older man's weathered face creased with a mix of concern and irritation. "Dillon," he greeted, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Glad to see you sobered up. What's this about, Tom?" Dillon asked, settling his lean frame into the chair. Years of hard living had left him looking older than his 32 years, though the sharp lines of his face still hinted at the handsome man he'd once been. "Got a situation out at the old Miller place," Sheriff Rollins explained, stroking his salt and pepper mustache. "New owners arrived, and there's been some trouble." Dillon's jaw tightened. The Miller place where he'd once planned to build a life with Catherine. Before the war. Before she died waiting for him to return. "What's that got to do with me?" "New owner's a woman doctor from Boston. Name's Palmer. Says she met you yesterday when you ran off some troublemakers." Dillon's eyebrows rose slightly. "The woman from the alley? She's a doctor?" "Indeed. And someone's already made it clear they don't want her here. Found her barn door splashed with red paint this morning, warning her to leave." Dillon stood abruptly. "Still don't see how this concerns me." Sheriff Rollins sighed. "I need someone to keep an eye on the place. Someone who knows the land thereabouts." "Find someone else," Dillon growled. "I haven't set foot on that property since—" "I know, son. I know." The older man's voice softened. "But you're the best man for this. You know every inch of that valley." Dillon turned to stare out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. 7 years since Catherine had died of influenza, while he was fighting a war that seemed without purpose. 7 years of drowning his grief in whiskey and taking odd jobs just enough to keep himself in bullets and bourbon. "I'll pay you fair," the sheriff added. "And Dr. Palmer seems a capable sort. She just needs someone watching her back until we figure out who's causing trouble." After a long pause, Dillon nodded curtly. 3 days. That's all. Then find someone else." The sheriff smiled with relief. "She's expecting you this afternoon." Winifred Palmer stood on the porch of the old Miller homestead, watching as a lone rider approached through the golden afternoon light. Her medical bag sat at her feet. She'd just returned from tending to a ranch hand with a broken arm at the neighboring spread. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the broad shoulders and distinctive posture of the man who'd intervened the previous day. His expression, visible now beneath his hat brim, was one of reluctance and barely concealed displeasure. "Dr. Palmer," he said by way of greeting, dismounting from his chestnut gelding. "Sheriff sent me." "Mr. Nash?" she replied with a small nod. "Please call me Winifred, or Winnie if you prefer. And thank you for coming." She gestured to the crude red lettering on the barn door visible from where they stood. Leave or die. Not exactly a warm welcome, she added, attempting a small smile. Dillon's eyes barely flickered to the threat before returning to her face. Sheriff says you're from Boston. What brings a city doctor out here? Winifred reached down to pick up her medical bag. The opportunity to practice medicine where it's truly needed. In Boston, there are dozens of doctors. Out here, she gestured to the vast landscape around them. People die from injuries and illnesses that could be treated with proper care. Noble, he commented, though his tone suggested he found it foolish. I also inherited this property from my uncle, George Miller. I believe he was the previous owner. Dillon's face hardened instantly. George Miller was your uncle? Winifred nodded, noticing the change in his demeanor. I never met him personally. My mother was estranged from her brother for many years. We were surprised to learn he'd left the property to me in his will. Dillon's jaw worked back and forth as if he were chewing on words he didn't want to release. Finally, he said, I'll check the perimeter. Make sure everything's secure. Then I'll set up camp by the creek. Camp? But there's a perfectly good bunkhouse, Winifred protested, gesturing toward the small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. I prefer to sleep under the stars, he replied curtly, turning back to his horse. Winifred watched him lead his mount toward the barn, noting the stiff set of his shoulders and the way his hand repeatedly drifted toward the flask-shaped bulge in his jacket pocket. Later that evening, as Winifred prepared a simple supper, she heard a knock at the door. Opening it revealed Dillon standing awkwardly on her porch, hat in hand. Found fresh tracks behind your property, he said without preamble. Someone's been watching the house from the ridge. Alarm flickered across Winifred's face. Someone local? Dillon shrugged. Hard to say, but they know the land. You got any idea who might want to scare you off? She shook her head. I've barely introduced myself to anyone in town, except for Sheriff Rollins and the clerk at the general store. A gust of evening wind sent a chill through the open doorway, and Winifred hesitated only briefly before saying, I've made more stew than I can eat alone. Would you care to join me? Dillon looked as if he might refuse, but then his stomach betrayed him with an audible growl. Winifred smiled. I'll take that as a yes. Reluctantly, Dillon followed her inside, his tall frame seeming out of place among the modest furnishings. He sat stiffly at the table while she served 2 bowls of fragrant beef stew. This place looks different, he commented, his eyes scanning the room. Did you know the previous owners? Winifred asked, setting a basket of cornbread between them. Dillon's spoon paused midway to his mouth. You could say that. His tone discouraged further questions, so they ate in silence for several minutes. Finally, Winifred spoke again. The sheriff mentioned you might know why someone would want to frighten me away. Dillon set down his spoon. There's always folks who don't take kindly to newcomers, especially women on their own. Is that all? She pressed gently. He met her gaze directly for the first time. This valley's seen its share of blood. Some folks think it's cursed. He pushed back from the table. Thank you for the meal, Dr. Palmer. I'll be checking the property periodically through the night. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Winifred was surprised to find Dillon already awake and tending to the chickens that came with the property. His movements were efficient but gentle as he scattered feed. Good morning, she called, approaching with a steaming mug of coffee. I thought you might appreciate this. He accepted the mug with a nod of thanks. You're up early. I'm expecting patients today, she explained. I posted a notice at the general store that I'd be receiving the sick and injured here until I can establish a proper office in town. Dillon's expression darkened. You're inviting strangers to your home when someone's already threatened you? I cannot allow fear to prevent me from doing my job, she replied simply. Besides, it's the best way to become accepted in the community. Before he could argue further, the sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. An elderly couple was making their way up the drive, the man clutching his arm in obvious pain. Winifred immediately went to meet them, her doctor's instincts taking over. Mr. and Mrs. Halloran, I presume? Sheriff Rollins mentioned you might be coming. The old woman nodded, helping her husband down from the wagon. His shoulder's been paining him something fierce for months. Doc Henderson in Branchwater said nothing could be done, but we heard you've got new methods. Winifred guided them toward the house. Let's have a look, shall we? For the next hour, Dillon watched from a distance as Winifred examined the old man's shoulder, her movements confident and her manner soothing. When the couple finally departed, the old man's arm was in a sling, but his face showed relief rather than pain. Throughout the day, more patients arrived: a mother with a feverish child, a rancher with a deep cut that needed stitching, and several others with various ailments. Winifred treated them all with the same careful attention, regardless of their ability to pay. By late afternoon, Dillon found himself reluctantly impressed. He'd seen army doctors during the war, but none with Winifred's combination of skill and compassion. As the sun began to set, a final visitor arrived: a young pregnant woman accompanied by her worried husband. "Dr. Palmer," the husband said anxiously, "my wife's time is near, and she's fearful. The last baby." His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Winifred took the woman's hands in hers. "I understand your fear, Mrs. Cooper. Would you allow me to examine you and discuss how we might make this birth different from the last?" The pregnant woman nodded tearfully, and Winifred led her inside. Dillon found himself keeping the nervous husband company on the porch. "First child?" he asked, offering the man a cigarette. "Second," the young farmer replied, accepting with shaking hands. "We lost our first during birth last year. Nearly lost my Elizabeth, too." They smoked in silence for a while before the farmer spoke again. "You're Dillon Nash, aren't you? The one who rode with Colonel Bedford during the war?" Dillon's expression remained neutral. "That was a lifetime ago. My brother served in your company. Said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Before Dillon could respond, Winifred emerged from the house, her face bright with optimism. "Everything looks healthy, Mr. Cooper. The baby is positioned correctly, and your wife's narrow pelvis isn't as concerning as the previous doctor suggested. With proper care during delivery, I believe both mother and child will be fine." The relief on the young farmer's face was palpable. As the couple prepared to leave, Mrs. Cooper suddenly clutched Winifred's hand. "Thank you, doctor. You're the first person who's given us hope since." She blinked back tears. After they departed, Winifred turned to find Dillon watching her with an unreadable expression. "You've given them false hope," he said bluntly. "Childbirth out here kills as many women as outlaws and disease combined." Winifred's chin lifted defiantly. "I've delivered over 60 babies, Mr. Nash, including many in difficult circumstances. I didn't offer empty promises, I offered informed medical opinion." For a moment, they stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Then, unexpectedly, Dillon's mouth quirked slightly. "You're not what I expected, Dr. Palmer." "And what did you expect? Some delicate Eastern flower who'd wilt at the first sign of hardship?" He gestured toward the horizon. "Sun's setting. I'll make my rounds before dark." As he walked away, Winifred allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. That night, a fierce storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain and howling winds. Winifred woke to a tremendous crash as a tree branch smashed through her kitchen window. Grabbing her shawl, she hurried downstairs to find rain pouring through the broken glass and Dillon already there, attempting to cover the opening with a piece of canvas. The wind shifted, he shouted over the storm. "Help me secure this." Together, they worked to fasten the makeshift covering, their hands occasionally brushing in the darkness. Once the window was secured, Dillon helped her mop up the water that had pooled on the floor. "You're soaked through," Winifred observed. "Were you sleeping in the bunkhouse after all?" "No," he admitted. "I saw the branch break off and hit your window." She raised an eyebrow. "You were watching the house in this weather?" "It's my job," he replied simply, wringing out a rag into a bucket. Winifred stoked the kitchen stove and put a kettle on to boil. "Your dedication goes beyond duty, Mr. Nash." He shrugged, water dripping from his hair. "Dillon," he said unexpectedly, "if we're going to be sharing midnight storm repair, you might as well call me Dillon." "Dillon," she repeated with a smile. "Then I must insist on Winifred, or Winnie." The kettle whistled, and she prepared 2 cups of hot tea, adding a splash of whiskey from a small bottle in her medical bag. "For medicinal purposes," she explained, handing him a cup. He accepted it with a hint of amusement. "You're full of surprises, document." They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the rain pound against the roof and the wind howl through the eaves. For the first time since meeting, the silence between them was comfortable rather than tense. "Were you a doctor during the war?" Dillon asked suddenly. Winifred nodded. I worked in a field hospital outside Petersburg. That's where I learned most of my surgical techniques, necessity being a harsh but effective teacher. You were at Petersburg? His eyes widened slightly. I was there too, with the 5th Regiment. Then we likely crossed paths, she said softly. Though I doubt you'd remember. We treated hundreds of wounded men each day. Dillon stared into his tea. I remember a nurse with gentle hands who sang to the dying. Couldn't see her face through the fever, but her voice. He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed by the admission. That wasn't me, Winifred said with a sad smile. I have a terrible singing voice. But there were many women who offered what comfort they could in those horrible times. Thunder crashed overhead, making the house shudder. Dillon set down his empty cup. I should check on the horses. Make sure they're secure in the barn. Be careful, Winifred cautioned. And thank you for coming to my rescue. Again, he paused at the door, rain lashing against his back. It's what I do. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Winifred was examining the damaged window frame when she heard the sound of hammering from outside. She stepped onto the porch to find Dillon measuring and cutting replacement glass from a sheet he must have brought from town. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. You didn't have to do that, she called. He glanced up briefly. Glass won't replace itself. I could have hired someone from town and pay twice what the materials are worth. He shook his head. Besides, I used to be handy with this sort of thing. Before. Winifred approached, curious. Before what? Dillon's hand stilled on the glass. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, before the war. Before Catherine died. Catherine, she prompted gently. My fiancée, he said, his voice rough. She was George Miller's daughter. We were going to marry when I returned from the war. His eyes lifted to the house. This was to be our home. Understanding dawned on Winifred's face. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. She died of influenza while I was away fighting. He continued, focusing again on the glass. By the time I got back, she was in the ground, and George had sold up and moved away. That explains your reaction when I mentioned he was my uncle, Winifred said softly. I never blamed him, Dillon said. He lost his only child. Couldn't bear to stay where every corner held memories. Is that why you've avoided this property for so long? Dillon's jaw tightened. The sheriff told you that. He mentioned you knew the land well, but hadn't been here in years. With deliberate movements, Dillon fitted the new pane of glass into the window frame. Some ghosts are best left undisturbed. Document. Winifred watched him work for several minutes before saying, My husband died at Petersburg. That's where I was working as a nurse when I decided to become a doctor. Dillon's hands paused again. I didn't know you were married. For exactly 7 months and 3 days, she said with a sad smile. Daniel was a surgeon. He taught me everything he could before a Confederate bullet took him. I'm sorry, Dillon said, and she could tell he meant it. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves, she said, reaching for a cloth to wipe away excess putty from the window. But that doesn't mean the new path can't lead somewhere worthwhile. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of shared understanding passing between them before he turned back to his task. Later that afternoon, as Winifred was organizing her medical supplies, a rider approached at a gallop. She recognized young Billy Cooper, the pregnant woman's husband, his face twisted with panic. Dr. Palmer, he shouted, nearly falling from his horse. It's Elizabeth. The baby's coming early, and something's wrong. Winifred was already grabbing her medical bag. How far along is the labor? Her waters broke this morning, and she's been having pains since. But now she's bleeding, and she can't seem to catch her breath between pains. I'll need to bring her here, Winifred decided. I have more supplies, and it's closer than your farm. I brought the wagon, Billy said, gesturing to where he'd left it at the end of the drive. Dillon appeared from around the barn. What's happening? The Cooper baby is coming early, Winifred explained. I need to fetch Elizabeth and bring her here. I'll come with you, Dillon said immediately. The trail to Cooper's place crosses Blackwater Creek. After last night's storm, it could be flooded. The urgency in his voice convinced Winifred to accept his offer without argument. Within minutes, they were in Billy's wagon, racing toward the Cooper homestead. Just as Dillon had predicted, Blackwater Creek had swollen beyond its banks. The normally placid stream was now a churning mass of muddy water. "We'll have to find another way around," Billy said desperately. "But the only other crossing is 5 miles upstream." "We don't have that kind of time," Winifred said, looking at the young farmer's anguished face. "How far is your farm from here?" "Less than a mile on the other side." Dillon studied the rushing water, then turned to Winifred. "I can get across and bring her back. I've forded worse during the war." "It's too dangerous," Winifred protested. "So is a complicated birth without a doctor," he countered. Before she could argue further, he had unhitched one of the horses and mounted it bareback. "Billy, you stay with Dr. Palmer. If I haven't returned in an hour, try the upstream crossing." Without waiting for a response, Dillon urged the horse into the swollen creek. Winifred watched with her heart in her throat as man and horse fought against the current, nearly disappearing beneath the rushing water at one point before struggling up the opposite bank. Dillon gave a wave of acknowledgement before galloping toward the Cooper farm. The next hour was the longest of Winifred's life. She paced along the creek bank, periodically checking her medical supplies and offering what reassurances she could to Billy. Just as she was about to suggest they try the upstream crossing, she spotted movement on the far bank. Dillon appeared, cradling a blanket-wrapped figure before him on the horse. "They're coming back," Billy cried with relief. Winifred's professional eye assessed the situation instantly. "The creek's too dangerous for him to cross with Elizabeth in that condition. We'll have to go to them." Without hesitation, she gathered her medical bag and headed for the wagon. "Billy, take me to the upstream crossing." Now, the crossing took precious time, and by the time they reached the Cooper farm, the sun was already low in the sky. Winifred burst through the door to find Elizabeth lying pale and sweating on her bed, with Dillon awkwardly holding her hand. "Thank God," he muttered when he saw Winifred. One examination told Winifred all she needed to know. "The baby's in distress. Elizabeth, I'm going to have to help this little one out quickly." For the next 2 hours, Winifred worked with focused intensity, directing Dillon and Billy to assist as she fought to save both mother and child. Outside, the sun set and lanterns were lit, casting long shadows across the small cabin. "Push now, Elizabeth," Winifred encouraged. "Your baby is almost here." With a final cry of effort, Elizabeth delivered a tiny, silent infant into Winifred's waiting hands. The room fell deathly quiet as Winifred quickly cleared the baby's airways and began gentle chest compressions with her fingertips. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "Breathe for me." Dillon watched her work, his face a mask of tension. He'd seen death too many times not to recognize its shadow hovering in the room. Then, miraculously, the baby gave a small, indignant gasp followed by a lusty cry. Elizabeth sobbed with relief as Winifred placed the tiny girl in her arms. "You have a daughter," Winifred announced, her voice thick with emotion. Later, with mother and child resting comfortably, Winifred stepped outside to find Dillon sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. "They're both going to be fine," she said, settling beside him. "Thanks to you getting me here in time." Dillon shook his head. "I just rode a horse. You're the one who performed the miracle in there." "It wasn't a miracle. It was medical training and experience." She smiled tiredly. "And perhaps a touch of divine intervention." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before Dillon spoke again. "You were right." "About what?" "About paths changing. When Catherine died, I thought my life was over. Started treating it that way too, drinking, taking foolish risks, pushing away anyone who tried to get close." Winifred listened without interrupting, sensing he needed to speak these words that had been bottled up for so long. "Seeing that baby take her first breath tonight," he continued, "it reminded me there's still life to be lived." "There is," Winifred agreed softly. "For all of us." The journey back to Winifred's homestead the next day was taken at a leisurely pace, both of them exhausted but content in the knowledge of lives saved. As they approached the house, however, Dillon suddenly reined in his horse. "Someone's been here," he said, his hand moving to his revolver. Winifred followed his gaze to see the front door standing slightly ajar. "I'm certain I locked it before we left." "Stay here," Dillon ordered, dismounting and approaching the house with caution. Winifred, of course, did no such thing. She followed several paces behind, her own small derringer, a relic from her war days, clasped firmly in her hand. They found the house ransacked, drawers overturned, furniture slashed, and supplies scattered. But most disturbing was the message painted across the wall of Winifred's examination room. "Next time it's your blood. Witch doctor." This wasn't random vandalism, Dillon said grimly. "Someone has a specific grievance against you." Winifred stared at the threatening words, a chill running through her despite the warm day. "But who? And why? I aim to find out." Dillon's voice was hard as flint. "Pack a bag. You're staying in town tonight while I talk to the sheriff." For once, Winifred didn't argue. The Silverstone Hotel was modest but clean, and the proprietor, Mrs. Abernathy, was sympathetic to Winifred's plight. "Shameful, the way some folks behave," she clucked, showing Winifred to a small room. "Doctor's a blessing in a town like this." After settling in, Winifred made her way to the sheriff's office, where she found Dillon and Sheriff Rollins deep in conversation. "Dr. Palmer," the sheriff greeted her. "I was just telling Dillon here that we may have a lead on who's been threatening you." "Who?" Winifred asked, taking the offered seat. "Doc Henderson from over in Branchwater," Sheriff Rollins explained. "He's been losing patience to you since you arrived, folks who weren't getting proper care from him. Word is he's been drinking heavily and making threats." Dillon's expression darkened. "Henderson's a fraud. Calls himself a doctor. But he's little more than a snake oil salesman with a medical license bought from some mail-order catalog." "You know him?" Winifred asked. "Had the misfortune of needing his services once after a brawl," Dillon replied. "Nearly lost my arm to infection from his treatment." Sheriff Rollins stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Question is, would he go as far as threatening violence? If his livelihood was threatened?" "Yes," Dillon said confidently. "And he knows that property well. He used to treat George Miller occasionally." A plan was quickly formulated. They would spread word that Winifred had been called away to a medical emergency in the next county, leaving the house empty for the night. Sheriff Rollins, Dillon, and 2 deputies would wait inside to catch anyone who might take advantage of her absence. "It's too dangerous," Winifred protested. "I should be there too." "Absolutely not," Dillon said firmly. "If Henderson is behind this, he's desperate enough to be truly dangerous." Sheriff Rollins nodded in agreement. "Best you stay here in town, document. We'll handle this." Outnumbered, Winifred reluctantly agreed, but as she returned to her hotel room, she was already formulating a plan of her own. That night, as darkness fell over Silverstone, Dillon positioned himself near the window of Winifred's ransacked examination room, a Winchester rifle across his knees. The house was dark and still, with Sheriff Rollins stationed in the kitchen and the 2 deputies covering the back door and barn. Hours passed with no sign of intruders. Midnight came and went, and Dillon found his thoughts drifting to Winifred, her courage in the face of danger, her skill as a physician, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think of any woman in such terms. Since Catherine, he'd kept his interactions with the fairer sex limited to brief encounters with saloon girls who expected nothing beyond an evening's attention and payment for services rendered. Winifred was different. She challenged him, frustrated him, and somehow made him want to be worthy of her respect. A soft noise outside jerked him back to alertness. Peering through the darkness, he spotted a shadowy figure approaching from the direction of the creek. The intruder moved with the confidence of someone familiar with the property, pausing occasionally to check for signs of occupation. Dillon signaled to Sheriff Rollins, who acknowledged with a barely perceptible nod. They would wait until the intruder entered the house before making their move. The back door creaked open, and footsteps moved cautiously through the kitchen. Dillon gripped his rifle tighter, every sense heightened. The footsteps paused, then continued toward the examination room where he waited. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, and Dillon tensed to spring when suddenly a second figure emerged from the shadows behind the first. "Stop right there, Henderson," came Winifred's voice, followed by the distinctive click of her derringer being cocked. "Damnation," Dillon muttered, rising from his hiding place as Sheriff Rollins rushed in with a lantern, illuminating the scene. Dr. Henderson stood frozen, a can of kerosene in one hand and matches in the other. Behind him, Winifred held her small pistol with a steady hand. "You weren't supposed to be here," Dillon growled at her. "Fortunate that I was," she replied calmly. He was planning to burn the house down. Sheriff Rollins quickly relieved Henderson of his incendiary materials and secured his hands behind his back. Edgar Henderson, you're under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted arson. The man's face contorted with rage. She's ruining me, he spat. Coming here with her fancy Eastern medicine, turning my patients against me. Your patients are choosing proper medical care over your drunken quackery. Winifred responded evenly. Perhaps if you'd actually attended medical school, you wouldn't find yourself in this position. As the deputies led Henderson away, Dillon turned to Winifred with exasperation. I told you to stay in town. And I decided that was poor medical advice, she replied, holstering her derringer in a hidden pocket of her skirts. Besides, I suspected Henderson might try something more permanent than vandalism. You could have been hurt, Dillon insisted. So could you. She stepped closer, her expression softening. I've lost one good man to violence, Dillon. I wasn't about to lose another without at least trying to prevent it. The implication of her words hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge what they might mean. Sheriff Rollins cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, I'd best get Henderson locked up. You two should get some rest. It's been a long night. After he departed, Dillon and Winifred stood in the damaged examination room, the lantern casting warm light over the chaos Henderson had left in his previous visit. My 3 days are up, Dillon said abruptly. Sheriff only hired me to watch over you until we figured out who was causing trouble. Winifred's heart sank, though she kept her expression neutral. Of course, you'll be wanting to move on, I expect. Dillon ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Actually, I was thinking I might stick around. This place needs a lot of work. He gestured to the damaged walls and furniture. Windows, just the beginning. Hope flickered in Winifred's chest. Are you offering to help me restore the house? If you'll have me, he said quietly. It would be fitting, I think. I once planned to build a life here. Maybe it's time I help someone else do the same. Winifred smiled, understanding the significance of what he was offering. I would be grateful for the help. This place deserves to be a home again. Over the following weeks, they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Dillon worked on repairs to the house and outbuildings, while Winifred tended to her growing medical practice. In the evenings, they would share meals and conversation, gradually piecing together the fragments of their broken pasts. Dillon spoke of Catherine, her laugh, her dreams, the future they'd planned together. Winifred told him about Daniel, his brilliance as a surgeon, his dedication to healing, the brief happiness they'd shared. Rather than creating distance, these confidences drew them closer, building a foundation of trust and understanding. The day Elizabeth Cooper brought her infant daughter for a checkup marked a turning point. Winifred examined the thriving baby girl, who had been named Winifred Catherine in honor of the two women who had ensured her safe arrival. She's perfect, Winifred assured the proud mother. You've done wonderfully with her. As Elizabeth prepared to leave, she paused at the door where Dillon was installing new hinges. You two make a fine pair, she observed with a knowing smile. Healing and building, that's what this town needs. After she left, an awkward silence fell between them. Dillon focused intently on his work, while Winifred busied herself arranging medical supplies. She's right, you know, Dillon finally said, still not looking up from the hinge he was adjusting. We do make a good pair. Winifred's hands stilled. We do. Dillon set down his tools and turned to face her. I never thought I'd feel this way again after Catherine. Didn't want to, truth be told. Seemed safer to keep everyone at a distance. I understand, Winifred said softly. After Daniel, I threw myself into medicine. It was easier to focus on healing others than to confront my own grief. Dillon crossed the room to stand before her. You've done more than heal the sick, Winnie. You've shown me that there can be life after loss. That a broken heart doesn't have to stay broken forever. Dillon, she began, but he gently touched her cheek, silencing her. I'm not good with words, he said. Never have been. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't gratitude or convenience. It's deeper than that. Stronger. Winifred covered his hand with her own. I've come to care for you too, Dillon. More than I thought possible. Their first kiss was tentative, a cautious exploration of newfound feelings. When they parted, Dillon's eyes held a warmth that had been absent when they first met. I can't promise it will be easy, he said. I've got habits that need breaking and ghosts that still haunt me sometimes. And I have a demanding profession and a stubborn streak a mile wide, she countered with a smile. But perhaps we can figure it out together. Fall turned to winter, and winter to spring. The Miller homestead, now known as the Nash Palmer place, flourished under their joint care. Winifred's medical practice expanded to include patients from 3 counties, while Dillon found purpose in raising horses and helping neighboring ranchers with difficult stock. On a perfect evening in May, exactly 1 year after Winifred had arrived in Silverstone, Dillon led her to a spot beneath the old oak tree behind the house. A small table had been set with a white cloth, flowers, and a bottle of wine. "What's all this?" Winifred asked, delighted by the surprise. "An anniversary of sorts," Dillon replied, helping her into a chair. "1 year since you turned this town and my life upside down." They dined as the sun set, casting golden light across the land they both now called home. After the meal, Dillon reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had this made in Denver," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small ruby. "It's not fancy like what you might have had back east, but it's perfect," Winifred interrupted, her eyes shining. "Absolutely perfect. Winnie," Dillon said, taking her hand. "I never thought I'd find love again. Never thought I deserved to. But you've shown me otherwise. You've mended what I thought was beyond repair, not just with your doctor's skills, but with your patience and your heart." He slid from his chair to one knee. "Winifred Palmer, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled onto Winifred's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Dillon. 1,000 times, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, the whispers that had once followed Dillon Nash around town came to mind. They said the cowboy's heart was too broken until she sewed it back together with patience. Some wounds, Winifred knew, took time to heal properly. But with proper care, even the deepest scars could fade, leaving strength where once there had been only pain. And as they stood together beneath the spreading branches of the oak tree, their silhouettes merging in the fading light, they were living proof that love, like medicine, worked best when administered with skill, courage, and above all, patience.